We're now going to start by making the tassel for our flap. I have here the D-ring strap piece. In the main tassel piece, I've on the wrong side of my tassel vinyl, I've drawn a line across the longer side, so the 4-inch side of my vinyl piece, and I've drawn a line across that is 1 inch down from the top edge. And now we're going to cut the fringe for your tassel. So I like to make, you can do whatever you prefer, but I like to have a lot of fringe. So I usually cut every piece 1/8 of an inch wide. And I use a ruler and my rotary cutter because it makes really nice straight lines this way. So there we have the beginnings. I'm going to go ahead and finish the rest of it, and then we'll restart there. I've now finished cutting the fringe for my tassel, and that's ready. Now I'm going to take the D-ring strap piece, and I'm going to cut it in half so that I have two pieces that are 2 inches long. I'm going to take one piece, pass it through my D-ring, and you can either base stitch these together. You want to make sure that it's wrong sides together, especially with my vinyl here. I have a bright white backing on it, so I would prefer that to be hidden. So you can either glue it or you can base stitch this together. And then you're also going to do the same on the other end with the remaining strap piece. So I'm going to just go ahead and base stitch these together just to be a little bit faster about it. And then we'll finish the assembly of our tassel. I've now base stitched the ends of my strap pieces so they stay together. And we're now going to glue the one piece. So I usually use the piece where there's the curved edge of the D-ring. And we're just going to place that here. So you can use whatever fabric glue you have on hand. I tend to use Fabri-Tac. It smells terrible, but it works quite well and it dries relatively quickly. So I'm going to glue this on this end. I don't leave much of the D-ring strap above the top edge of the tassel. I like to have it quite low down on the tassel piece. And now you're going to just put a bit more glue. Don't put too much, otherwise when you're done rolling at the end, a whole bunch of glue will come out. I may be speaking from experience. So you just go ahead and roll your tassel. All right, there you go. So you can use, if you have a Wonder clip, or I tend to use just regular alligator clips, but you can clip this so that it dries in place. And then if you want, you can add a rivet. I like adding a rivet. I think it makes a nice decorative touch to your tassel, but it's completely optional. You don't need to do that. And we're just going to set it aside and let it dry until the glue has set completely. So my tassel is dry, and I'm going to go ahead and add a rivet, mostly decorative, but it also helps to keep the tassel together. So I've just made a little dot in the center, and I'm going to use my hole punch No, I don't have any fancy tools for setting rivets. I've always done it this way. This is actually it's a pretty good hole punch that I've purchased from Tandy Leather. It's a rotary hole punch. Comes with a bunch of different sizes. I've never had to use really any other size. I even use this hole punch for setting twist locks when they have the holes for the screws. I usually use my this rotary hole punch to make those holes as well. So now I'm just going to add my rivet. I always use double cap rivets. I don't really use anything else. Now I'm going to go ahead and hammer this in. I'm not going to do this on the video because that will be very loud and unpleasant. So I'll go ahead and set the rivet and then we'll come back and finish the flap. Now my tassel is ready and I can add it to the bottom of my flap. Make sure that you take the exterior piece of your flap, not the lining piece. Although it doesn't matter all that much, but I like to put it on my exterior piece. So fold your flap in half vertically, wrong sides together, and mark the bottom center of your flap. Open it up. And then place your tassel. Now, don't forget when you place your tassel that you're going to want to put it wrong side up. So I have a seam on the back of my tassel, so I don't want that showing on the front of the bag. So I will make sure that that's wrong side facing up, so that when you turn your flap right side out, you'll have the nice side of your tassel showing. So I'm just going to hold this in place. A little clip, my unfancy alligator clip, if it will let me do it. That's not working at all. There you go. So I'm just going to go ahead and base stitch this in place, and then we will install the magnetic snap on the lining piece of our flap and finish the flap assembly. Now take your lining piece of your flap and place it wrong side up on your work surface. Take your flap A pattern piece and place it on the wrong side, and then mark the location of your magnetic snap on the wrong side. So on the pattern piece you'll see there's a little half circle with the words magnetic snap. That's the location of your snap. You'll just want to mark that on the wrong side. You're then going to take one of the washers from your magnetic snap, and you're going to center the center circle hole in your washer with the mark that you just made, and then mark the prong holes on either side. And then you're going to carefully cut these out. You can use your seam ripper. Just make sure that you don't cut too big of a hole, because then your snap will be loose. And just stick it in, and then stick the end out, and then make your hole, and do the same for the other side. To prevent your fabric from fraying where you've cut the holes for your magnetic snap prongs, I like to apply a drop of fray check on each hole, and then you'll want to take the male half of your magnetic snap, so the one that has the little part that sticks out, and you're going to want to push the prongs in through those holes from the right side of your lining piece of your flap. And then I like to make it even sturdier. So what I've done is I've taken a little scrap piece of Peltex, which is a sewing interfacing, and then I also place that over the the prongs, and then I place my washer. And then I spread my prongs. Rotary cutters come in handy for all sorts of things. And then I want to protect the exterior piece of my flap from the metal prongs. I don't want them to wear a hole in my flap. So what I like to do is take a little scrap of fusible interfacing, and I cover the whole thing, and then I will take this over to my ironing board and I will fuse this in place. All right, now I have my piece of interfacing fused over top of my snap. You're going to take your flap lining piece and your flap exterior piece, and you're going to pin them right side together. If you prefer clips, you can clip them together. And then I'm going to go ahead and sew these pieces together along the side and the bottom curved edge, but you don't sew the top straight edge of the flap. You need to leave that open to turn the flap right side out. Make sure when you start sewing at the top corner that you backstitch here, and also at this corner when you're done sewing the pieces together, you're going to want to backstitch again up here. So now I'm going to sew the two flap pieces together. I'm going to start by backstitching a little bit. When you get to your tassel, you want to make sure that you push your D-ring out of the way. You don't want to accidentally sew over it. That would be not a great thing. And then backstitch again when you get to the end. Cut your threads. And we'll go back to the cutting table now. My two flap pieces are now sewn together, and we need to either clip or trim the seam allowance. I find that trimming it to 1/8 inch usually does about the same thing as clipping it or notching it, which takes a bit more time, but you can do whatever you prefer. So I'm going to go ahead and trim the seam allowance to 1/8 of an inch. I'm not going to trim where I have my tassel D-ring strap because I don't want it to accidentally get tugged out. I think it just makes it a little bit sturdier if you don't trim that portion of the flap. Plus it's a fairly straight edge at the bottom, so it should be okay. So now we're going to go through the opening at the top and turn the flap right side out. I like to poke it out nicely like this. And now I'm going to take this over to my ironing board, and I'm going to iron the seam nice and flat. Make sure that your edge at the bottom is nice and round. And then we're going to go ahead and do the top stitching. So now I've gone ahead and ironed my flap to make sure that the seam allowance is nice and flat. Make sure that when you do that, that you press on the wrong side of the flap and the top side of the flap as well. And then use a longer stitch length for top stitching. I like to use a stitch length of 3 or 3.5 depending on what materials I'm working with. For fabric, I tend to use a stitch length of 3, and for vinyl I use usually 3.5, sometimes 4. So I'm just going to go ahead and top stitch all around with 1/8 inch seam allowance. If you want to get a little bit more decorative, you can go ahead and do a second line of top stitching. I kind of like that look on this sweet pea because it adds a little bit of something extra to the flap.